Kawagarbo, also commonly referred to as Kawagarbo or Kawagarbo, is a magnificent 6,740-meter peak located in a remote region of China within the Mili Zhuoshan range on the border of the Yunnan province and Tibet. Now, notably, Kawagarbo's striking slopes have long held significance as a prominent holy site in the ancient Tibetan religion, Bon, as well as more contemporarily relevantly within Tibetan Buddhism as well. Kawagarbo is, in fact, so significant within Tibetan Buddhism that it's estimated that an approximate 20,000 pilgrims make the nearly 150-mile trek through the rugged and remote wilderness to visit it each year. Now, while I've covered religiously relevant peaks on the channel before, such as Kangchenjunga and Nanda Devi, neither's religious relevance were specifically tied to the peak's sanctity or virginity remaining intact and the summit remaining unclimbed, which is the case for Kawagarbo, however. Due to its remote location, its, by high altitude climbers' standards at least, modest height, as well as the staunch local resistance to the prospect of mountaineers climbing on, and more importantly, potentially successfully summiting its sacred slopes, Kawagarbo, as well as all the major peaks of the Mili Zhuoshan range, sport extremely sparse climbing histories, akin to those of some of the world's most difficult and dangerous peaks. Now, the prospect of mountaineers and locals clashing over climbers potentially summiting sacred peaks is a controversial and rather politically charged topic within the sport of mountaineering throughout the years, with the result of the most notable example of such a conflict being the banning of mountaineering within the nation of Bhutan entirely, resulting in the world's 40th highest peak, the 7,571-meter Gangkhar Punsum, standing as the world's highest unclimbed peak to this day. However, such restrictions are more of a modern convention, and attempting such an ascent throughout a majority of the 1900s was not looked upon by the greater mountaineering community with the same level of contempt such an attempt would likely garner in modern times. Although such attempts have undoubtedly always been a morally gray endeavor to attempt to undertake, regardless of the time period. The first attempt to ascend Kawagarbo would take place in the year 1987 when a team of Japanese climbers hailing from the Jotsu Mountaineering Club would make their way to the foot of Kawagarbo. However, the mountaineers were well aware of the peak's sacred status, and thus, instead of attempting to ascend the peak outright, they instead used the trip to gather reconnaissance on the mountain, while they also made a concerted effort to garner goodwill from the locals, as they would donate supplies and funds to them, and founded a school to help educate the rural Tibetan local youth. Notably, the Japanese climbers did not state outright their eventual intention to attempt to summit Kawagarbo to the locals, as even the suggestion of someone summiting the peak was met with what the Japanese climbers found to be a surprising level of hostility from the locals. Thus, the 1987 Japanese team would ultimately depart from Kawagarbo without so much as setting up a single camp on its slopes. Additionally, despite their best efforts to butter up the locals with their generosity, the Japanese team left the region with a clear understanding that, even after they'd gone above and beyond most mountaineers' efforts to grease enough palms for the locals to look the other way for their potential future ascent, they found that the local people were still unwavering in their contempt at the prospect of mountaineers potentially attempting to ascend their sacred summit. However, despite this, the 11 Japanese climbers from the Jotsu Mountaineering Club would ultimately return to Kawagarbo, along with a further 6 Chinese climbers who joined up with the expedition team nearly 4 years later in the final few days of the year 1990. With the true intent of their return to the region obfuscated from the locals, the 17 climbers would enlist the help of several local shepherds as guides to help lead them to Kawagarbo, as well as to help haul their gear. Now notably, while Kawagarbo's uppermost slopes were strictly off limits for humans as far as the locals were concerned, partially ascending its slopes was a common practice amongst both religious pilgrims and the local people alike, and thus the locals weren't immediately innately suspicious of the intentions of the 17 foreigners when they asked the shepherds to help guide them up its lower slopes. However, the accepted threshold for such partial ascents was to climb no higher than approximately 4,500 meters, and thus when the climbers came to a halt at an elevation of 3,800 meters, the local guides would assume that they were briefly stopping to arrange their belongings before heading back into the valley. However, the bombshell reveal of the group's true intentions would finally be revealed during this stop, which the climbers had only taken in order to affix their crampons to their boots. When confronted by the local men, the climbers confirmed their intent to attempt to summit Kawagarbo, to the disbelief of the locals. Despite the locals voicing their great displeasure with the group's decision, regardless, the 17-member expedition team would forge ahead up the peak's imposing slopes, fully understanding that, while their ruse had worked to afford them this opportunity to attempt to summit Kawagarbo, this would likely be their one and only shot to reach the summit successfully. The expedition team would establish their Camp 1 at just above 4,500 meters, as they were aware that even the undoubtedly upset locals wouldn't dare ascend past the sacred threshold at 4,500 meters. Indeed, this would seemingly prove to be a shrewd decision on the team's part, as the duped local shepherds would rush back to their local village to alert everyone to the trespassers on Kawagarbo's upper slopes. Predictably, this news was met with widespread outrage amongst the local populace, and many locals would pray to Kawagarbo's deity, a local warrior god bearing the same name, to dole out punishment to the climbers for their uninvited intrusion. Additionally, a local lama would cryptically predict through a series of alleged visions that the climbers would manage to successfully ascend as high as 6,500 meters, but he would also predict that they would not reach the summit successfully, as he prophesied that the warrior god Kawagarbo would unleash his wrath with fatal consequences for the climbers in the 240-meter stretch between 6,500 meters and the summit, and unfortunately for the climbers on Kawagarbo's sheer slopes, the local lama's divinations would in fact turn out to be a frighteningly accurate prediction of the fates of the climbers on Kawagarbo's slopes just a few days later. On the mountainside, the expedition team would continue to make their way up Kawagarbo's steep slopes, however just a few hundred meters above the line of no return. At an approximate elevation of 5,100 meters, an argument between the Chinese and Japanese climbers of the team would erupt, as the Japanese climbers wanted to set Camp 3 as close to the ridge as possible to optimize their ascent towards the summit, as well as provide them cover from avalanches, while the Chinese climbers were insistent on setting Camp 3 on the less sheltered plateau. Ultimately, they would compromise setting Camp 3 approximately halfway between the plateau and the ridgeline. On December 28, 1990, the team would continue to make their push towards the summit, setting up Camp 4 at an approximate elevation of 5,900 meters. The team would attempt to make a push for the summit the following day. However, foul weather would force the team to abandon their attempt just 240 meters shy of the top, forcing their retreat back to Camp 4. The team would continue to wait out the storm over the next few days, as their food supplies dwindled to only a few scraps. However, at 10:30 p.m. on January 3, 1991, the team would radio base camp to inform them that while they were running low on supplies, The team had unanimously agreed to make another push in earnest for the summit, possibly even setting up a further Camp 5 if necessary. The following morning at around 6 a.m. on January 4th, 1991, concern for the team on Kawagarbo slopes would begin to mount, as they would fail to contact base camp at that time as they had arranged the previous evening. The team would further fail to check in throughout the rest of the day, which would result in the team at base camp calling for rescue efforts to be mounted. However, initial search and rescue efforts were hampered by further foul weather, which prevented a helicopter from surveilling the slopes from above. A team of Chinese rescue climbers would arrive to search on foot on January 8th. However, their efforts were hampered by the widespread unfamiliarity with the peak slopes, as well as further foul weather. Over the following few days, the foul weather would clear enough to allow for a helicopter to surveil from above, where it captured images of a massive, approximately 300,000-ton avalanche that had recently swept down Kawagarbo slopes, with its path coinciding with the team's planned route. Thus, after the Chinese rescue team on the ground after several days had also failed to locate any trace of them, all 17 members of the expedition team were presumed to have perished in the avalanche, which, due to the team's sudden silence between the evening of January 3rd and the morning of January 4th, it was assumed that the avalanche had swept them up sometime during the night as they slept. Over 8 years later in 1999, the remains of 16 of the 17 missing climbers were discovered on the Ming Glacier, with the stopped watch of one of them frozen in time, reading 1:34 a.m. 2 years later in 2001, China would ban all mountaineering activities in the Maili-Zuishan range, bringing all further attempts to summit the peak to a screeching halt, and thus Kawagarbo remains unclimbed to this day. Thank you all for watching.